The flames hissed like a living thing, hungry, relentless. Clara Evans coughed as acrid smoke filled her throat, her wrists raw from struggling against the iron shackles that held her fast to the burning wagon. Sparks leaped from the dry wood, dancing like fireflies against the dark prairie sky. The heat licked at her skirts, curling the fabric as if it would swallow her whole. A scream tore from her lips, not for mercy, not for help. No one was coming. She had learned long ago that the world did not listen to a woman's pleas. Elias had made certain of that. He had watched her struggle. His thin lips curled in amusement as he tossed the last of the whiskey from his flask onto the wagon's side. The fire had taken to it immediately, leaping higher, hungrier. His boots crunched on the dry grass as he stepped back to admire his work. "Should have learned to keep your mouth shut, Clara," he had said, voice thick with liquor and cruelty. "Now look at you." Then he had ridden off into the night, his laughter fading into the vast, empty plains. The chains bit into her wrists as she pulled with everything she had left, but there was no give, no weakness in the metal. The iron had held wagon wheels steady over endless miles of dirt and dust. It would not yield to the desperation of a woman left for dead. The heat pressed against her skin, 1,000 unseen hands forcing her forward. Clara twisted, kicking her legs, trying to find purchase on the packed earth beneath her. If she could get her feet under her, if she could leverage her weight. The wagon groaned as part of the wood collapsed inward. A fresh wave of sparks shot into the air, burning her cheek. She bit back a sob. No. She would not die here. Not like this. Through the haze of smoke, the endless black of the frontier stretched before her. Somewhere out there, past the loneliness of the plains, past the cruelty of men like Elias, was freedom. A world where she did not have to live in fear. But she would never reach it if she didn't get free. She twisted again, fingers clawing at the iron that bound her. The key was gone, thrown into the dust by Elias before he had set the fire. He had wanted her to see it, to understand the hopelessness of her fate. A punishment for daring to run. A punishment for daring to dream. The smoke thickened, curling in her lungs like a living thing. Clara clenched her teeth, refusing to cough, refusing to give in to the weakness that wanted to drag her under. If she lost consciousness, she would never wake again. Then, through the roar of the flames, came another sound. Hoofbeat. At first, she thought it was Elias returning to watch her die. He had done that before, tormenting her with false escapes, waiting until her hope flared just long enough for him to crush it beneath his heel. But the shape that emerged from the darkness was not her husband. The rider moved like a shadow against the night, his horse a streak of muscle and speed beneath him. He did not charge toward her recklessly, but with the steady, measured pace of a man who understood danger intimately. His face was hidden by the low brim of a war bonnet, the long eagle feathers trailing behind him. A rifle was slung across his back, the hilt of a knife visible against his hip. Lakota. Clara had heard the traders speak of them in hushed voices, fearful of their swift horses and sharper arrows. But to her, the man before her was not a warrior, not a raider. He was salvation. He pulled his horse to a stop just beyond the fire's reach, dark eyes scanning the scene before him. He said nothing at first, as if assessing whether she was worth saving. Clara gasped, her strength nearly spent. "Please!" The warrior's gaze flicked to the chains, to the fire that crept closer with every second. And then he moved. He was off his horse in an instant, striding toward her without hesitation. The fire's glow danced against his bronze skin as he reached for his knife. The blade flashed in the firelight as he wedged it between the iron links, his grip steady, practiced. The metal groaned under the pressure, but the chains held fast. He muttered something in Lakota, his tone unreadable. Clara flinched as another wave of heat pressed against her. The fire was nearly upon them now, the wagon ready to collapse entirely. The warrior didn't hesitate. He turned his knife, angling it downward, and with a swift, brutal motion, drove the blade into the lock itself. Sparks flew as metal met metal, the iron warping under the force of the strike. A second blow. A third. The lock snapped. The chains fell from Clara's wrists, clattering onto the scorched earth. She nearly collapsed, her limbs weak with exhaustion, but the warrior caught her before she could fall. His grip was firm, calloused hands steadying her as she gasped for air. "Come." The word was rough, accented, but unmistakable. He pulled her toward his horse, lifting her onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. The movement sent a fresh bolt of pain through her limbs, but she barely noticed. Her vision swam, the smoke, the heat, the sudden rush of air as the horse surged forward, overwhelming her senses. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the burning wreckage of the wagon collapsing in on itself, the fire consuming every trace of the life she had left behind. She woke to the scent of sage and earth. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her, her limbs heavy, her body sore. The memory of fire clung to her skin, a phantom heat that made her shiver despite the cool night air. The warrior sat a short distance away, tending to the fire. His movements were slow, deliberate, his gaze flicking toward her as she stirred. "You live." Clara swallowed, her throat raw. She managed a nod. A silence stretched between them, neither quite knowing what to say. Finally, she forced herself to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. Her wrists were raw, dark bruises forming where the iron had bitten into her flesh. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself. His dark eyes held no malice, only quiet observation. His hair was long, falling in thick braids over his shoulders, adorned with beads and strips of leather. The war paint that streaked his face had faded in places, worn away by wind and time. She cleared her throat. "Who are you?" He regarded her for a long moment before answering. "Tusunka Ska." She tried the name on her tongue, her voice hoarse. "White Horse." A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise, perhaps. Then it was gone. Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Why did you save me?" He did not answer immediately. He turned back to the fire, feeding another branch into the flames. It cracked and snapped, sending embers into the night sky. Finally, he spoke. "You were chained." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep into Clara's bones. She was chained. Not just to that wagon. To Elias. To a life she had never chosen. She looked down at her wrists, at the bruises that marked her like a brand. And for the first time in years, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope. The silence stretched between them once more, but it was different now. Not empty. Not fearful. Clara took a slow breath, the air cool against her burning lungs. She was still alive, and she would not waste the second chance that had been given to her. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying the scent of earth and distant rain. Clara sat by the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames dance in the cool night air. The heat was different here, safe, nothing like the hungry blaze that had nearly devoured her. Yet, the memory of the fire clung to her skin, a phantom heat that refused to fade. Across from her, the warrior sat in silence, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate movements. The blade caught the firelight, flashing in the dim glow. He had not spoken much since they stopped for the night, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying her as she recovered. He was a man of few words, but Clara had already learned that his silence spoke louder than most men's voices. Tusunka Ska. White Horse. She had rolled his name over in her mind throughout the night, letting the syllables settle on her tongue in a way that felt unfamiliar but oddly fitting. He had saved her. Without him, she would have been nothing more than a pile of ash on the frontier. And yet, she knew nothing about him. She shifted, the ache in her wrists reminding her of the chains that had bound her. The bruises were deep, purpling against her pale skin, but the pain was a dull throb now, no longer sharp. She had been through worse. Clara glanced at him, her voice rough. Why were you out there last night?" His knife paused for the briefest moment before he continued sharpening. "Hunting." She waited, expecting him to say more, but he didn't. His eyes remained on the blade, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filling the silence between them. Clara exhaled, her breath curling in the cool air. "You could have left me." "I could have." Her lips pressed together. He did not say it with cruelty or indifference, it was simply a fact. He had made a choice to save her. And for that, she owed him her life. She hesitated before speaking again. "Where are we going?" He didn't look up. "Away from here." That much she could have guessed. Elias would be searching for her soon, and if he found her, the fire he had left her to die in would seem like mercy. A shudder ran through her. "He'll come looking." Now, White Horse did look at her. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, but there was something else beneath it, understanding, perhaps. A knowing that told her he had seen men like Elias before. That he had fought them, killed them. "He will not find you," he said. Clara wanted to believe him, but she knew Elias too well. He was not a man who let go of what he considered his, and she had belonged to him for too long. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I need to get further. Beyond the frontier. Somewhere he can't reach." White Horse studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Nowhere is beyond reach. Not for men like him." Clara clenched her fist. She knew it was true. Running had never worked before. She had tried 3 times, and each time, Elias had found her. He had beaten her, locked her away, taken everything from her. And yet, she was still here. A flicker of anger curled in her stomach. No, not anger. Something else. Something colder. Harder. "I won't go back," she whispered. White Horse nodded once, as if he had already known that. The fire crackled between them, and for the first time in years, Clara felt something unfamiliar in the presence of a man. Safety. By the time dawn stretched its golden fingers across the land, they were already riding. The sky was vast, endless, painted in hues of rose and amber. The scent of damp earth rose from the grass, the promise of rain lingering in the morning air. Clara sat behind White Horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait soothing in a way she hadn't expected. She had never ridden like this before. Elias had never allowed her near the horses. He had kept them for himself, like everything else. Her place had been in the house, silent, obedient. Now, with the wind in her hair and the vastness of the world stretching before her, she realized just how small he had kept her. They rode hard, putting as much distance between themselves and the burning wagon as possible. White Horse rarely spoke, but Clara found she didn't mind. His presence was enough. She didn't need words, only distance, only freedom. As the sun climbed higher, they slowed near a river, the water rushing fast and cold over smooth stones. White Horse dismounted first, offering his hand to help her down. Clara hesitated, then took it, the warmth of his palm grounding her in a way she couldn't explain. She stepped onto the grass, her legs weak from the long ride. The river called to her, its coolness a temptation against her sweat-streaked skin. She knelt by the bank, cupping the water in her hands and drinking deeply. It was crisp, clean, nothing like the stale well water of Elias's ranch. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment. Behind her, White Horse let out a low sound, something between a warning and a command. Clara turned just as he pulled his rifle from his back. A shadow moved across the tree-line. She barely had time to react before the gunshot rang out. She flinched, the sound ripping through the peaceful morning like a jagged wound. White Horse moved fast, shoving her behind him as he aimed his rifle toward the trees. Silence. Then, another shot. Clara hit the ground as White Horse fired back, his stance steady, unshaken. She pressed her palms against the earth, her breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. She had heard gunfire before, but never this close, never this real. Another shot whizzed past them, splintering bark. White Horse cursed in Lakota, grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward the horses. "Move!" Clara scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering as she swung onto the saddle. White Horse mounted beside her, his rifle still in hand. With a sharp command, he urged the horse forward, and they tore away from the river, the world blurring around them. The shots continued, but they did not stop. Clara clung to him as they raced across the open land, her pulse roaring in her ears. She didn't know who had fired at them. She didn't need to. There was only one man who wanted her dead. Elias. The chase was on. The sun was high when they finally slowed, their horses lathered in sweat. White Horse pulled them into a small, sheltered canyon, the towering rocks offering cover from the open plains. He dismounted first, scanning the horizon, his expression hard. Clara slid off the horse, her knees nearly buckling. She caught herself against the saddle, her breath still coming too fast. Her hands shook. White Horse turned to her. "You ride well." She let out a short, breathless laugh. "I had no choice." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't used to. Vulnerable. Safe. She swallowed. "It was Elias, wasn't it?" White Horse hesitated before answering. "His men." She exhaled slowly. "He won't stop." "He will." His certainty sent a shiver through her. She wanted to believe him. Needed to. But Elias had spent years proving that she would never escape him. She looked down at her wrists, at the bruises that were beginning to fade. He had tried to kill her, burn her alive. And still, he hunted her. Something in her broke then. Not in the way it had before. Not in the way Elias had tried to break her. This was different. It was the shattering of chains. The severing of fear. She lifted her chin, meeting White Horse's gaze. "Then we kill him first." For the first time, White Horse smiled. Not a large smile, not a boastful one. But it was enough. And Clara Evans, for the first time in her life, was ready for war. The wind carried the scent of blood and gunpowder, a sharp tang that clung to the back of Clara's throat. She lay flat against the rocky outcrop, her fingers clenched around the rifle White Horse had given her. The weight of it was foreign but solid, grounding her in the moment. Below, the dust swirled where the riders had slowed, their silhouettes shifting in the late afternoon sun. Elias's men. 4 of them, moving with the quiet confidence of hunters who believed their prey was already caught. They had trailed her across half the frontier, relentless, and now they were close enough that she could hear the jangle of their bridles, the murmur of their voices. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She could still hear Elias's voice from the past, low, threatening, always laced with the promise of pain. "You can't outrun me, Clara. You never could." But now, she wasn't running. She exhaled slowly, tightening her grip on the rifle. Beside her, White Horse was motionless, his body coiled with the kind of stillness that came before a strike. His knife gleamed in his hand, and his eyes never left the men below. Clara whispered, "How many bullets do we have?" "Enough." It wasn't an answer, not really, but she trusted it. Trusted him. In the days since he had pulled her from the fire, she had learned that White Horse never said more than was necessary, but when he spoke, his words held weight. The men below dismounted, tethering their horses. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, spat into the dirt before speaking. "We know you're up there, girl. You can come down nice and easy, or we can drag you down." Her pulse slammed against her skin. Elias wasn't here. If he had been, he would have spoken himself, would have drawn out the moment just to watch her squirm. But these were his men, and they wouldn't leave without her. White Horse shifted, his muscles tensing. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "You take the one on the left. I'll handle the rest." Clara swallowed. "I've never." "You will." It wasn't cruelty, but certainty. A demand. Because she had to. The scarred man took a step forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Ain't got all day, girl. Come on out, and we won't make this harder than it has to be." Clara's fingers trembled. She had seen men die before, had seen Elias shoot a man in the street over nothing more than a misplaced word. But she had never held the gun, never been the one who had to pull the trigger. But now she had no choice. The first shot rang out like thunder. Scarred face jerked backward, a strangled cry ripping from his throat as he hit the dirt. Clara barely had time to register what she had done before chaos erupted. White Horse moved like a shadow, his knife flashing in the dying light. He was on the closest man before he could draw his gun, the blade sinking deep into his gut. The man gurgled, eyes wide with shock before his knees buckled. The remaining two spun toward the ridge, pistols drawn. Clara fired again. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dust near the man's feet. He cursed, lifting his revolver, and White Horse was there, his rifle cracking like a whip. The man's head snapped back and he crumpled. One left. The last man, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, hesitated, his gun shaking in his grip. He wasn't a fool. He had seen enough to know he was outmatched. But he made a mistake. He ran. White Horse didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait." He frowned, but he lowered the barrel slightly, watching as the man scrambled toward the horses. Clara inhaled sharply. "Let him go." White Horse's jaw tightened. "He will tell Elias." "Good." The word tasted bitter on her tongue, but she meant it. Running was over. Elias had sent his men to drag her back, but now only one was left to tell the story. And when he did, Elias would come himself. That was what she wanted. She let out a shaky breath, lowering the rifle. "This ends with him." White Horse held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. The last man mounted his horse and rode hard into the horizon, dust rising in his wake. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for Elias to find her. She was going to find him.